Hello, and welcome to Real Talk for our community. I'm Jimmy McGee. I'm the CEO of the Impact Movement, and I am delighted that we're back. We have Memorial Day off. We went and got some ribs. And if you're a vegetarian, yes, my wife is one. We had some veggie patties, and we're back. But we're back with more people this time. And I'm delighted tonight to introduce to you Michaela Powell. She's a rising junior at LSU. She's a part of the Impact Movement, and she's going to help me co-host tonight. And before we introduce our guest tonight, I got to get everyone up and ready for this Facebook Live and share it about the watch party that we're about to have. Start the watch party. There we go. One thing I want to tell you, if you can go to the Impact page and like it tonight, that's where we're going to be posting getting all our questions. So go to the Impact Movement Facebook page or go to YouTube channel for the Impact Movement. And there, if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll be aware of all these live programming from us. So as we start, Michaela is going to introduce our first two guests, these two beautiful women that's coming on, and then I'll take over the guys. Go ahead.
All right, so we have Marla Frederick, who is actually a chairman of the Impact Movement. She is a professor she was a professor of religion and African American studies at Harvard, and she will now be a professor at the Candler School of Theology. And she is a Spelman graduate. And next we have Linda, who has worked with traumatized people since 1997. She has a master's degree in counseling psychology from the Seattle School of Theology. And she is committed to the recovery and healing and well-being of her people.
Hey, there's Linda. Hey, and let me introduce two more guests. We've got Richard Dean coming. Richard Dean is from Georgia. He's a UGA undergrad, went to Michigan Law School. He's a former U.S. attorney, former judge, and he was a former managing partner of the firm. He just got out of that position in January. I'm excited to have Richard Dean. We had a wonderful conversation a few months ago, and he's joining us here. How you doing, Rick?
Glad to be here.
Excellent. And last and not least, and I really mean last, like last minute, is J. Cameron Carter. We had to replace him in, and we're really excited to have him. He went to Temple. He's a friend of Marla, and he's going to come on board, I hope, in a second. There he is. The streets are short because J. Cameron Carter was talking about Temple, and all of a sudden I just threw out some names, and these are all buddies of his. He got an MDiv from Dallas Seminary. He's a former professor at Duke Divinity School, and now he's a professor at Indiana University, a place where they play a little basketball and also the home state of Mike Pence. How you doing there, Jay?
I'm doing all right.
Excellent, excellent. And so tonight, as we begin this conversation, there's a lot happening in the United States right now. Over these past 6-7 weeks, we've experienced 3 traumatic deaths. And then right now, we've got a lot of unrest, civil unrest all throughout the country. I just heard on my phone that the 9 p.m. curfew was announced for the city of Atlanta. And I'd like to get some opening statements or just thoughts about your feelings about what is happening right now in our country. And if you don't mind, why don't you start first, Jay? We're going to swing it around and end with Michaela, my co-host.
Oh, I actually wish you hadn't started first with me. I'm still trying to process all of this. I think the fact that I'm a lost for word really, I think, speaks to the fact that we are words to try of sense of what's going on. In some sense, it doesn't make sense. Watching that video of that policeman taking the life of George Floyd just right out of his body just took, in some sense, we all were having our own breath stamped out of us. In a way that was moving parallel with what was happening to Mr. Floyd, and then I'm thinking of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, thinking about a young man down in Georgia who had been really murdered by deputized police and folk who thought they had the right to police. And all of this, we got the coronavirus. I just think we're in a moment of found reckoning for this empire. America, all of present in bullying the surface. And I just think, given the widespread protest, the demonstration, and downright rioting, and I don't say that as a critique because I think that there's a place for that. I think with all that's going on, this country is brought to a tipping point. We have to figure out what's going to be the step forward, or will the whole project that is called America, simply collapse?
That's true. Well, Rick, you're a lawyer. You study the law. What's your impression of what's going on in our society today?
Well, I think it's the law and then far beyond the law. I think if we're looking to the law to actually provide as much insight about what's going on right now, we're at a loss because the law generally follows circumstances and it generally follows events. And so I don't think the law can really set forth in any appreciable way, meaningfully, what's going on right now. What's going on right now is really much deeper than what the law can address. Now, it doesn't mean that the law can't punish and the law shouldn't hold people accountable and responsible. But in terms of where we're going as a nation and where we're headed as a people, the law is going to follow all of that, and it doesn't really set much of a course for where we are going. I think really it's our leadership, and it's recognizing that we're in a fight for, in some respects, we're in a fight for the, not to co-opt a phrase that one of the politicians is using currently, but we are in a fight for the soul of our nation. And I think a lot of the things that are going on now, if they're not checked, if they're not confronted, they will fundamentally change the character of this country. Perhaps, well, who knows for how long, or if it could ever be undone. But we are seeing the shattering of norms. We're seeing the shattering of just civility. We're seeing the shattering of just a simple recognition of the humanity of each other. And because of all that, I think our country is headed in down a path that is fundamentally destructive. And whether or not we can retrieve it, whether or not we can change course, whether or not we can, redeem the soul of this nation, is really at issue. I think it was, I believe it was General Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, who talked about the fact that democracy has a very thin shell. And I believe that fundamentally to be true. I mean, if you look at Nazi Germany, no one would have ever thought that the kinds of things that happened there could have happened there because they were a democratic society. And just incrementally, because good people allowed bad things to happen, we ended up with atrocities occurring. And not to say that we're headed in that path, it's just to highlight the fact that good people have to always stand in the face of abject evil. And I think in many ways, that's what we're confronting. We're confronting abject evil in our society, in our country.
Oh, wow. Wow. Go ahead, Michaela.
And Miss Linda, what thoughts do you have?
Yeah. My heart is heavy. We are in trauma. We're in trauma as a culture, as a people, as a nation. We are in trauma. And now, because of COVID-19, I think the world has its own measure and degree of trauma. So when I say we're in trauma, not only do I mean we're in trauma emotionally, psychologically, our bodies are feeling the impact of trauma. We don't know what to do with ourselves. So over the past 6, 7, 8 weeks, we've been kind of locked into our homes. And then we have all of these flashpoints, traumatic things happening to our people, and we're witnessing it. So we have the trauma of COVID-19 and its impact, the trauma of a social injustice, the trauma of seeing people, hearing about people being murdered. We are in trauma, and trauma can take away our sense of self. It takes us from ourselves. So many of us don't know what to do with that. I agree that we are encountering abject evil. Absolutely, what we're encountering feels otherworldly, and yet it manifests in every aspect of our lives. And we are being taunted, I think. Um, I want to say that we matter, particularly as people of color, we matter. It's a simple statement, simple concept, but I don't think we can say it enough in a context where we're seeing people murdered by systems of power and people imposing their will upon us. We matter, our lives matter. And our healing, we can take that into our hands to some degree, that we cannot wait for so called white people to see us as worthy or valid or deserving of being seen as human. That work is going to happen, and it has to start with us seeing ourselves and decoding, undoing some of what has been internalized. Um, it's going to start with us creating systems where we create safe spaces for each other, where we get to feel and breathe, literally, where we get to feel and breathe and be and name and say what we need to say and present ourselves however we need to present ourselves. But we've got to begin to create safe spaces all around, because help is not coming from the government, and it's not coming from, not necessarily, it's not coming from outside our culture. Um, so I am concerned about our well-being. I'm concerned about our healing, and I'm concerned about our psychology. But we hold the power to heal. We are not given over to evil. Evil does not have the final say.
And I see, Miss Marley, you have a shirt that says Black Lives Matter. As Miss Linda said, that our lives do matter. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and this shirt, I was telling Jimmy when I signed on, this shirt has the names of so many Black people who lost their lives to extrajudicial violence. And I was like, it's a shame. I bought this shirt maybe 2 years ago, and now you have so many more names to add to a shirt like this. And so how am I feeling? A bit overwhelmed. When I called in tonight, I was leaving the virtual memorial service for my great aunt who passed away last week due to COVID-19. And so it's a disembodied kind of celebration of a woman who gave so much of herself to so many people. She showed up for people's lives, she cooked and cared for people. But we couldn't come and show up for her in celebration. And so I was notified of her death on Monday. And then I watched a public execution on Tuesday. And then the country just imploded by Thursday and Friday. And so the week was overwhelming. And just to think about the ways in which it exploded had to do with the things we could see. We could see the officer squeezing the life out of George Floyd. We could see that. But there are so many other systems of oppression that we don't see. We're not watching, it's like COVID-19, so many people are dying, but we're not in the hospitals to see it. And so people pretend as if it's not happening. And mass incarceration is happening. We don't see it every day because we're not in the prisons. There's the level of social inequality, wealth inequality, environmental justice, all of these issues are constantly at play in our society. And what is most frustrating for me, because so much of it has to do with white supremacy and the ways in which the white supremacy has kind of ingrained a level of social inequality into our system. And what's so frustrating for me as a Christian is that too often it feels that the Christian ethos of the country undergirds and sanctions the status quo. And so I deeply feel like there needs to be a movement of Christians who really work to see the life of Christ lived out in our country and really believes in these issues around justice. Like, God really wrote these into the scriptures. And so we really have to live them out. And how do we communicate that not only to Black students, but to this larger white evangelical culture who, and I won't go into so much more, but was just almost formed in protest against that very thing. White evangelicalism was formed as a protest against the social gospel. You know, the National Association of Evangelicals is formed in the 1940s, and then the National Religious Broadcasters is 1944, and they're formed as a literal protest against the social gospel. And so we are at this moment where Christ needs to speak into this culture to address systemic evils, and yet the Christianity that so many people have adopted doesn't give them the tools to do that, because it was created not to give them the tools to do that. So it's just, that's how I'm feeling.
Wow. Michaela, am I on again? I think I'm unmuted. So we're introducing tonight's topic as racism, Black codes, and staying alive. So here's the interesting thought about Black codes. And I'm going to go back to Jay Camry. I haven't heard from him from a while. Black codes, I want you to begin to explain that, Jay Cameron, but you're a theology professor, or formerly was at Duke Divinity School. You went to DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary. And I'm going to tap into what Marla said and saying that, wow, our Christian faith was not something that opposed Black codes. It's almost, it undergirded it and gave it foundation to live and breathe. And even though Stamped from the Beginning is not a theological book, it talks about the heavy influence of Christian religion on this nation. Why are you a professor of of theology, in light of how you feel so volatile about what's happening in the world today? It doesn't seem to jive. Where do you go with that?
Well, in many respects, it doesn't jive. Can you all hear me? I changed my, put on my earbuds. Okay, good. Yes. In many ways, it doesn't jive. In many respects, we have to reckon with the fundamental contradictions of the country and how those contradictions are religious contradictions. The contradictions between how Christian faith, as Marla was saying, in many respects undergirds the white supremacy of the country. And yet, there were those who, in time, through a number of historical machinations, decided, as my grandmother would say, to make Jesus her choice.
Shut up.
Right? And so, but in making Jesus her choice, she enacts a Christianity, the way I sometimes put it, a Christianity against Christianity. A Christianity that's an alternative Christianity, a Christianity that is otherwise. In other words, every Christianity ain't the same Christianity.
Shut up.
And in fact, we need to learn what kind of Christianity that we are living into. We must remember that the United States of America is founded through and mobilizes these logics of the sacred, these logics of Christianity, in order for it to be what it's going to be. And what each and every one of us has to decide is the degree to which we want to live into that ongoing socialization. The very notion of becoming a citizen in this country is drenched with like kind of practices of what's normal versus what's abnormal. And much of that is underwritten by Christianity. Now, I don't want to talk too long, but one of the things I think is crucial for Christians, for those of us who would name the name of Jesus, like I'm going to use my grandmama's phrases tonight, those of us who would name the name of Jesus, the question that we have to get our heads around is, how is it that when we name the name of Jesus, that actually has helped to certify us into the order of things rather than break the link to the order of things? How is it that our baptism is not a baptism that breaks these codes of violence, right? That causes us to imagine ourselves and understand ourselves as differently positioned in the world, which is what our baptism should signify, which is what these faith practices should signify. The question for us is, how is it that in becoming Christian, it certifies us into the order of things rather than breaking it? And I'm of the view that there are traditions out there that practice Christianity differently. And from those traditions, we might learn something.
Wow. Wow. Now, before Michaela's going to ask a question, I want to remind our audience that in a little while, we want you to ask us questions. And if you can ask questions, not in our watch parties, but ask questions on the Impact Live Facebook page or on the YouTube page, we will then ask our guest tonight those questions that you have. We want to encourage you not to listen to us, but engage us in this dialogue. Michaela, go ahead and you can ask our next guest a question.
So I want to touch on Black codes. Miss Marla, when we think about Black codes, how is this affecting the minds and the souls of Black people? And even if you want to touch on what Black codes are, like I know before Mr. Jimmy talked to me, I wasn't really aware of what Black codes look like in today's generation and that they were still a real thing.
You know, Black codes have to do with the regulation of Black bodies and Black people having to be accountable to a certain order. And if you break that order, then you risk being arrested, you risk life and death. And so what that looks like for me today is thinking about the authoritarian nature of the police force and the sense that Black people are expected to immediately and without question obey the police officer. And if they step outside of that, then you risk extrajudicial violence in a way that whites don't. I've thought about this so much in thinking about how it's almost circumscribed in a type of white supremacist imagination that Black people don't have the right to speak back, the right to disrupt, the right to question in a way that whites have a right to speak up and question the things in which they're being asked to do. And so much of that then leads to the type of extrajudicial violence that we see against Black bodies doing the simplest things, right? So Sandra Bland is pulled over in Texas because she crossed the line. She didn't put her signal on. And the officer tells her to get out of the car. She is asking the question, well, why do I have to get out of the car? And it is because of her questioning that then he gets angry and pulls her out the car, and you know the rest of the history. And so there's an expectation that Blacks will immediately be in subjugation to a kind of white authority. And that is some great part of the problem.
So let me engage in this because I want to ask the Black coach question to both Richard and Linda. So for Richard, Black codes were illegal. They don't exist anymore. Isn't that Brown versus Board of Education? This stuff is supposed to have been taken care of. That's what the Civil Rights Movement did. And then, well, Michaela, you can ask Linda the next question afterwards. But am I right? You're a lawyer and a former judge. Are the Black codes in law or are they gone?
Well, Black codes were following the Civil War. And immediately following the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction where the Northern Army and the forces that had prevailed in the war started to likely implement some, what might have turned out to be some long-term positive changes throughout the South. But it wasn't long thereafter because there was a political compromise that was made to allow President Johnson to assume office and to hold office, and he needed the help of Southern white Republicans in order to sustain him in that position. All that led to the northern authorities, the soldiers, the troops, the Freedmen Bureau pulling out of the South. What that then led to was the South essentially reinstituting slavery. And the way they did it was through what you're referring to as black codes. These codes were actually laws. They were written laws, but they were written laws intended only to suppress black people. There were laws that said if you were black, you couldn't be out after a certain period of time, after 6 o'clock. Black, you couldn't leave one job and take another without the consent of your white employer. If you were black, you couldn't travel from one city to another. I mean, there's just any number of these things that were put in place, and these were the black codes. And these things existed and continued and got more and more draconian as we went into the early 1900s. As you went into the early 1900s, there was a new system to further institutionalize this new form of slavery that was basically referred to and known as convict labor. And so what would happen is they would use any minor violation of any law, whether it was a black code or any other law, or frankly, sometimes it didn't even matter. It was just the whim of a local sheriff or a local politician or frankly, any white person. And they would take you into custody, send you through on occasion, send you through some railroaded process that purported to be a court, all of which then would lead you to serving time. And the whole goal of all of this was to get you into a posture where you were serving time, because once that happened, then you were enslaved. They would take your labor. You could be farmed out to a mining company. You could be farmed out to a farm to go harvest a crop. You could be farmed out for any kind of manufacturing process. Virtually any kind of work that they wanted to extract from you, they used these black codes and then this system of slavery by another name, which is how Blackman, current author, refers to it. But that's how they maintained all of that. And one of the things that's important about that, and then I'll be quiet, is that it's the legacy of how it is and why it is that we as African Americans understand that there's fundamentally something wrong about the criminal justice system, because it's embedded within our DNA to know that it's been used to suppress us. And even though, as you say, these codes were done away with, they haven't been done away with for that long. I mean, the whole notion of Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 54. I integrated the school system in Macon in 65. So, what we're talking about here are things that really aren't ancient history. We really have a very recent and very short term experience with any notion that's approaching trying to provide full rights to African Americans. We basically have since maybe the mid 60s, probably the early 70s, to where we likely are now is the only time period in which these codes were done away with to give you some semblance of active freedom within a democratic society. It's a very short-lived freedom that we have. It's a very new phenomenon in some respect.
And it doesn't feel so free right now for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Miss Linda, how would you say that these black codes affect our psyche and our souls?
Oh, she's on mute.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we got you.
Great. Well, we were created for freedom. We were created to have freedom of expression, being, movement, and all of these codes restrict that. So what happens over time is, as people of color who are having to live with these spoken, unspoken black codes, the messages get internalized, right? And so there is a loss of a sense of self. There is a loss of a sense of wholeness. There's a loss of a sense of freedom to be who we were created to be as image bearers. And so these Black codes, though they're not lawful anymore, they're very much written in our psyche, in our soul. And sometimes we have this subconscious response to Black codes. So, for example, how many times have you or people you know been in a context with white people, and there is maybe a white professor or someone in leadership, or just a white person that's a colleague? How many times do Black people defer to white people? You know, how many times do they defer? How many times when you're listening to a professional that you sometimes prefer a white voice or white professional over a Black voice or Black professional? And sometimes it's happening and you don't even realize that you've been conditioned to value whiteness above who you are and above your own people. And so it's a subtle, incessant, persistent conditioning. And we're not, no one is really protected from it. So the work for us is that we've got to do serious work of undoing, standing against, relearning, and coming to value who we are and what we bring, because we're daily being conditioned to devalue who we are and value whiteness, however it presents itself, that they're right, they have authority, that there's something about them that's superior to who we are. Most of us have had to do serious work to tear that down, to deconstruct that. But if we're not intentional about deconstructing, that's what we're left with if we're not taught otherwise. So yes, it gets encoded in our soul, and our soul, as I understand it, is made up of our mind, emotions, and our will. Right?
Wow.
So what do we feel when we're around white people? What do we feel when we're around cops? Do we have a sense of ease, or have our emotions been conditioned to express itself in a particular way? Do we have high anxiety? Do we feel nervous? Do we feel unsafe when we're around certain groups of people? Mainly people who identify as white. That has an impact on our emotions, what we've been conditioned to believe, and we sometimes revert to default mode because our body will tell the truth beyond, sometimes more than our mind or that prefrontal cortex. We will make up excuses and deny what our body is telling us. So we're reacting to all of these things that have been coded in white psychology, in the psychology of whiteness, and in the psychology of Blackness. We've been responding to it, and it won't change unless we're deliberate about addressing it and uprooting.
So
no, go ahead, Michaela. Go ahead.
I was going to say I have an add-on to that. I know last year was the first time I ever got pulled over, and as you said, I did respond in a way where, like, I was very nervous. I was very tense. I saw my body change. So how would you suggest that we move forward in deconstructing this trauma that we have been taking in for such a long time? Like, what steps would I take, or would anybody take who has been living like this for a long time?
Yeah, you're right to call it trauma. We are in trauma, and it's a complex, layered, ongoing trauma. But we were not created to address this trauma alone. So one, I would say, acknowledge and own what you feel. It's okay to say that you felt scared or afraid. Own what you feel, own your emotions, name them, and know that it's valid, that it matters because you're feeling it. And then the second part is not only owning it, but find a circle of people, whether that is one other person or multiple people. Find a circle of people so that you can connect and be yourself and find a sense of camaraderie with other people who are like-minded. So we're not meant to walk through this trauma alone. We're meant to be in this with other people. And so it matters that you find a circle where you are able to feel what you feel, where your body is able to relax, and where you're able to feel like you're at home, that you're known and you're understood. it's a double trauma to experience trauma and then to be isolated and have no one to journey with you through it. So find safe spaces so that you can be yourself and feel what you need to feel. And then there are ways to uh, find moments to play, find moments to be creative, to find goodness again, because otherwise we'll be confined to thinking that evil rules the day, and it does not. It does not. It feels like it. It looks like it in a lot of ways, but evil does not rule the day. So be intentional about finding goodness. And that looks different for all of us. But be intentional about finding goodness and being committed to self-care. And we're having to learn what does self-care look like for us. Because we've come from a tradition where so much of life was about surviving and getting just maintaining not a lot of time or space left for self-care. So be intentional about that. So those are some, 3 or 4 things to do to begin that process and being intentional about it.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
One of the things we still want to encourage our audience to ask questions for us. These are some rich, gifted people, and it's a treasure to have them here. And I want to hit my boss, Marla Frederick, and Jay Cameron again with the same question. So I want you to think through this. So for Marla has a PhD in cultural anthropology, and I have a master's in anthropology. And I remember studying and learning that anthropology as a discipline was used in the oppression of Black bodies. And only in that discipline, it's only like 0.5% of all the anthropologists are Black PhDs. Marla, you correct me since you went a step further than I. And I'm curious to know for you, Marla, how do you reconcile your love for cultural anthropology, knowing what it's done historically to us, and then how do you wield it to unleash us to be free? And then I want to jump back to Jay Cameron about theology about that after that, because theology is used in the same way. But let me go with you, Marla, first.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just anthropology and theology, it's sociology, it's psychology. It's like all of these fields have racist histories. So anthropology is not alone, but anthropology was certainly instrumental in the construction of these categories of race. Between Christianity and anthropology, I mean, they were instrumental in developing these categories, these racialized categories that had, white people at the top of this hierarchy and Black people at the bottom, and they were measuring brains and trying to figure out who had the largest brain and who had the smallest brain. And so anthropology was instrumental in creating a kind of the kind of eugenics project that was active in the United States in the early 20th century. And over the years, there's an anthropologist, many of you know Franz Boas, and sociologist Du Bois. Franz Boas is the one who gave us this term cultural relativism, right? Because he argued that there is no such thing as a hierarchy of races, that cultures are simply different. They have different ways of learned ways of being, right? And so from that, Du Bois helped us to think about, well, what is race? And thinking about race as a system of power, right? That race was about creating a system that allowed one group to rule over another group. It was about political and economic power. And so you put all these, you put Italians, French, English, you gather all these cultural groups into one identity called white, and then you do the same with all the different African ethnicities and put them in one group called Black, and then you create this hierarchical system where Blacks are to serve whites, and you build not only a kind of anthropology around it, theories and anthropology around it, but you build Christian theology around it. Christian theology helps you to construct that. And so as a Christian and as an anthropologist, so not only are we in a small percentage as a Black anthropologists, but I think some 90% of anthropologists are atheist agnostic, and I understand how that happens. I really do. But for me, it was really important to think about all the ways in which Black anthropologists since the 60s really have challenged anthropology and have written a whole new narrative. And so for me, going into anthropology was a way to not only talk about the power structures that are inherent in American society, but it was a way of telling the stories of Black people's lives and giving those Black lives value. And so I'm deeply committed to that, and love the fact that I have an opportunity, or have had opportunities, to help train students in thinking about how do we study Black life, how do we write the histories of Black people, and how do we reclaim a narrative that has been so detrimental historically when other people have written our stories.
Wow. And so, Jay, I'm going back to you. Everybody talking about heaven ain't always getting there. So how do you reconcile this theology where you love Jesus, you love Black people? Is there a trauma in working in theology trying to deal with these realities of helping people to have faith in Jesus, but not be co-opted by the empire?
Right. Well, in many respects, much of what I was going to say on this, Marla has already beautifully said. And one of the, amongst the many things she just said, one of the most important things that she just said was that the entire architecture of modern knowing is bound up with race. There's no getting around it. Now, what makes theology, in my view, distinct is that theology in many ways was a practice of cultural anthropology before that formal discipline comes online in the 19th century. Which is, again, to say that theologians, in the 15th century, in the 16th century, were in effect the first, quote unquote, cultural anthropologists, right? Those who practiced who were trying to work out who man is, what man is, and doing so in relationship to and in construction of the perceived other. So the other did the work of clarifying to the Euro-Christian what it meant for them to be Euro-Christian, or more generally within theological terms or theological anthropology, what it meant to be properly human. The properly human was defined in relationship to the improperly human, or the other.
Now I need to say, shut up, because you talking right now, Dave. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
This was the work of theology. And this is why I say that theology was the midwife of the modern world. And in being the midwife was the midwife of modern racial thinking. It was the midwife of the political as we know it. And in being the midwife of the political as we know it, it was the midwife of the racial. Raciality, coloniality, the political, they're all bunched in a knot, and the theologian was the midwife. So when you ask me, why do I engage in theology, and why do I think everybody needs to engage in theology? Because we are all caught up in the world that the theologians created. Even when somebody says they're secular, they're still in it.
Right.
It reminds me of this poem by Fred Moten. He has this poem that that's titled, "I ran from it, but was still in it." You can run from theology all you want, but we are inside of its dynamics. And part of the problem is that when we think religion and when we think theology and when we think Christian faith or whatever faith, we have been so schooled and conditioned by a certain kind of Protestantism, I might underscore, to think that these are just individual decisions. It's my personal belief, I choose not to believe, or I choose to believe, rather than thinking of theology as a social text. Let me say that one more time because it's crucial. Theology functions as a social text. It is that through which we enter into and become socialized. We enter into society. We enter into the space of being seen as a citizen or not properly a citizen. All of these are theological machinations at the level of cultural and social text and cultural scripts. That's what's at stake when we think theology. And so as a theologian, I'm committed to try and understanding theology then as a social technology. And at the same time, I'm interested in thinking about what kind of social technology was at work when my grandmother, who was a Christian preacher, a storefront B3 Hammondist organist, what kind of social text was she wrapped up in this alternative expression of Christianity? There is another way for us to be social. The ways in which we've been given to be social by under the rubrics of we the people, and the way in which that rubric was already delimited by an in and an out, and the way in which that was already structured as a theological procedure, even as it was a political procedure, there are alternatives to how we think our we-ness. And we've got to think of Christianity that can think our sociality and our we-ness different from theology's normative functioning as a social text and a social script.
Wow. Wow.
And this is the deep thing. If I had one last thing, just to say one more time, what's so deep about it is I had to finally appreciate that my grandmother was my first theological teacher in the way I'm talking about.
Well, now would you just shut up? I'm telling you, I'm about to
My
throw something
grandmama
at
and them, they understood this at the visceral level of lived experience of Black life. Black life encodes the alternative already, is what I'm trying to say. And we must think what I call the paratheological codes of the Black alternative.
Wow. 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 Now, if all of our audience, if you're getting ready for the GRE, you're getting a lot of prep work in the recording, both from all of our guests. So you're going to have a lot of stuff about the brain. You're going to know a lot of stuff about the law, history, and anthropology. You'll be ready for the next GRE. Michaela, you want to ask a question I think the audience has for us.
Yes. So Jonathan Rutch says, do any of the panelists have a lament, psalms, or pre-written prayers that they could join them in praying, that we could join them in praying?
Oh, wow. You can direct to any person on the panel who wants to jump in on this. Is there a psalm that you're mourning right now? Go ahead. We haven't heard from you, Rick, for a while. Is there one that you have?
To do is to pray the Psalms or to pray through the Psalms. And one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 103. And so I'll turn to that and I'll read it through. And as I'm reading it, I convert or try to convert the verses into prayers as I'm reading it through. But you can do that with many of the Psalms. Maybe you want to skip the precatory, some of the ones that are calling down, death and destruction on your enemy. Or maybe that's where you want to dwell on. I don't know. But I find it very comforting to go into the Psalms and to essentially pray them and to use the text of the Psalm as a basis for my prayer.
Okay.
If the verse were to say, "Oh Lord, my Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth," the prayer for me would be, "Oh Lord, you have revealed to me that your name is excellent in all the earth. May it be ever so." Or just something along those lines. And the Spirit, I believe, will guide you in doing that, because I don't think you could have a closer, more intimate prayer life than to use the word, the scripture, pray to who I believe is the author of the scripture.
Marla, do you have a psalm? I know you shared and you invited us into the sorrow you had of today's funeral and your events that happened last week. Did you have a psalm that you could reflect on?
You always feel like you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death.
Mm-hmm.
This period of time.
Yeah.
That's.
Think
about being hard pressed on every side, but that's not.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, but I think that is a psalm. I know for me, Kirk Franklin and Fred Hammond did a concert yesterday. And I didn't know. I mean, I underappreciated Kirk Franklin until I heard some of the songs that were coming out of his library. And Fred was singing Romans 8 yesterday. And Fred, I can tell you this right now, Commissioner Fred Hammond, I wouldn't be in front of y'all if it wasn't for them dudes. And songs are nothing but songs. And I'm alive because of Fred Hammond and Commissioned. And you asked my wife, she said, this dude, Mitchell Jones, wrote every song that saved my life. So, yeah, we do have another.
Is it okay if I
go ahead? No, go ahead, Chief.
Okay, very briefly. I mean, this is a curious question. It's a good question, and I was I was wondering why I was so hesitant to jump in. And I was wondering, it's like, oh my goodness, have I become, just utterly a heathen? I don't think I have. But it did make me wonder. And the psalm that came to my mind was that passage. I think it might be Psalm 8, but it's in the form of a prayer. The psalmist asked this question / praise: why does the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing?
Mm.
And it got me to thinking as well, not only because I think that we're in a moment in which white supremacy is raging. It's, in my view, I'll go ahead and lay out my own politic. I mean, you can imagine where I'm coming from, but for me, I mean, when I think of Mr. Trump, I mean, I really just, why does the heathen rage? When I think about what these police officers are doing in the meting out of extrajudicial violence, why does the heathen rage and the people keep imagining a vain thing? And in many respects, prayer in me, what I like about that passage is the question and / the prayer doesn't offer up an answer. It becomes a zone by which the psalmist can vent about the absolute abjection that the people Israel and Judah are facing. And I think many times we have come to prayer as if the answer is going to be neatly packaged and come and all that kind of stuff. But what I like about that psalm that came to my mind was that the psalmist opens up prayer as a zone of lamentation, of the expression of exasperation, and in a search for how to respond to a world that is structured against the psalmist. Or what, if I updated it, what a number of Black critical theorists would say, a world constituted through anti-Blackness. How do we endure? And I'm using that word advisedly. What does it mean to endure through a world constituted and structured for your demise? And I use that word endure because endure is a word that I use to translate what faith means. Faith is a practice of endurance. Black faith is endurance. And if anything, the response to the raging of the heathen, the world constituted and structured through anti-Blackness, is Black faith, by which I mean the capacity to endure.
I have
That's
one, if I can share it.
Go ahead.
Oh, so Psalms 139 is something that I find myself repeating a lot, which is, I praise you because I am wonderfully and fearfully made. And I think in a world, or I'm seeing that it seems like my life as a Black person is not valued. But I know that scripture says otherwise, that I am still made in the image of God, even though He created me Black on purpose. And so I think that's one thing that I've been constantly reminding myself, and something that me and my friends constantly remind each other of.
Wow.
When I cut my hair and went natural about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, that was the psalm I repeated to myself in the mornings, reaffirming my decision, because we didn't live in the culture then that affirmed Black natural hair, that affirmed your Blackness as you were born. It was just a different time period. It feels like it.
Yeah.
It's a struggle for life. Go ahead, Linda. Go ahead, Linda.
Sorry. 91 has been. You hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Psalm 91 has been a song that I've been meditating on through this very disruptive season. But I've been thinking about the Psalms as a collection of experiences and thinking of how it's been laid out. And you all know this: orientation, disorientation, reorientation, right? So I think of it as construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. So it feels really hopeful to think of it as a way of thinking through the impact of racial trauma, and to think about how do we heal and move forward. Is what does thinking about our orientation mean? thinking about how we've been constructed as beings, as people, as a result of this social engineering, right? So to think of and identifying, naming, where are you right now? White people, where are you right now? What do you honestly believe in? Can you be honest with what you believe about yourself and about other people? Can you be honest about what your experience of white supremacy, what you hold to? Can you be honest about how you've participated in this system of oppression and where you've looked away and where you've stepped back and where you've denied the stories of people that are hurting? So, orientation, where are you right now? Can you be honest with? And as for people of color, can we be honest with how we've been assaulted by oppression? Maybe the places that we've internalized some of these wicked and false lies, these falsities about who we are. Can we be honest about that? Right. And then this process, moving to this process of being deconstructed, undoing, disentangling ourselves from the lies that we've been washed in from birth, and I would venture to say even in utero, that we've been washed in, of undoing, denying, relearning who we are. Our sense of self is not not a result of what white people say, but a sense of self that the people we love say and that God has said about us and that we say about ourselves, right? And then that process, that final process of reorientation or that final process of reconstruction. So you identify where you are, you challenge and you undo, and then you rebuild or reconstruct. And I think that might be a useful way of disentangling ourselves from the stickiness and the pervasiveness of white supremacy. Like, yeah.
Well, the questions are coming, and we're moving on. People want to know everybody here on the panel, so we're showing everyone's name. And I'm going to pick two people to ask this question. This is from Kelly Knight Clifford. What would you want a white preacher to say to his 99% white church this coming Sunday? Oh, I'm going to have fun with this one. So I'm going to pick you, Rick, to answer that first. And then I can't wait to hear Bonner Frederick answer that after you either. This is going to make my night.
Well, I'll stumble through it and then I'll let Marla clean it up. But, you know, I attend First Baptist Atlanta, which is a huge, you probably heard of it. It's Reverend Stanley's church here in Atlanta. And, you know, we've been live streaming for the last 2 months, I guess, a little over 2 months. And so the associate pastor has been doing most of the preaching. And so yesterday, I was really wanting to know and think and see what it was that he was going to say. And I got to tell you, I was so pleased. I was so affirmed by what he did. And what he did was he just simply spoke truth. I mean, he recognized and acknowledged the evil of what we all saw in the death of Mr. Floyd. We all saw that. And you can't talk about there's no way, in my judgment, you can shade that for anything other than what it was. So if you don't acknowledge that as a Christian, I don't see how you're speaking truth. And so he did. He acknowledged it. He said that it's causing pain, it's causing hurt, it's causing frustration. He prayed for the leadership of our city. We've got an African-American female mayor whom I love. He prayed specifically and extensively for her leadership, for her mother's heart. He prayed that she would turn to her mother's heart as she led the city through these terrible times. And so what he did was he acknowledged the harm. He may not understand it all. I don't know the answer to that. He may not understand the depth of how it affects all of us, but he acknowledged the wrong. He affirmed the wrong of it all. And he used what was to me was just what you would expect of looking at the scriptures, holding that up to the times and saying, God, forgive us. God, forgive our heart towards you, our hearts towards one another when we see something like this. And so for a pastor, my father's a pastor, I know, and my brother is as well. So I know what their sermon would have been. I was pleased to see that this man, one of his, I don't know whether it's 90% white, but it's majority white, just simply spoke truth. You had to acknowledge the wrong of what we all saw. You had to acknowledge the hurt, the pain of what we all either experienced or frankly should have experienced. And he did that. And I was surprised in some respects, but I was very, very pleased to see that he had done
it. That's excellent. Marla? Jake Cameron wants to hear what you're going to say, Marla. That's why he's looking at you right now.
I repent. Whew. There's so much. I mean, anybody can see how absolutely outrageous and horrendous the death of George Floyd was. What we couldn't see was in the officers' smug pressing his knee into his neck and leaning into his neck and staring at the camera, the kind of reckless abandon, the sense of impunity that he felt as though this was acceptable and it would be acceptable. That comes from a system that has already affirmed your capacity to do whatever you want to do. And so to the extent that white pastors and white evangelicals have supported white supremacy, have elected white supremacy, and continue to support it, I think there's great need for repentance. And I don't know that white evangelicals have the full capacity, the template for addressing justice issues, because as I said at the beginning of the forum, they were formed out of the organizational structure was formed out of a protest against what they saw as the social gospel. All these Christians coming together, opposing slavery, opposing unfair labor laws in the early 1900s. And so evangelicals came as a way of, seeing themselves as biblical Christians, identifying themselves as more biblical than the people who were fighting on these justice issues. They decided to focus only on the individual. So to the extent that individuals could pray and receive salvation, then the world could change. We saw this in Billy Graham in the 60s. Billy Graham never stood up for Martin King and the civil rights movement. I saw an interview with him once. He said his greatest regrets was that, one, he didn't go on. He was an undergraduate major in anthropology. He regretted that he didn't get a PhD in anthropology. And two, he regretted that he did not stand up for King because so many more people died and so many people's lives were destroyed when he thinks he could have had influence. But he didn't have the toolkit because evangelicalism was all about and has only been about the individual and individual soul salvation. And a scholar, I'm going to read this, Michelle DuPont, writes a history of white evangelicals in the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. There's a book called Mississippi Praying. And it's one of the most profound statements in the entire book. She writes, contrary to evangelicals' assertions, the conversion of every Mississippian in the state would never correct the sufferings caused by an exclusionary political system, a deficient educational system, a discriminatory economic system, and an unfair judicial system. Yet, this individualistic notion of social change allowed Mississippians, among other Southern evangelicals, to decry government initiatives as ineffective and unwarranted intrusions. And if we ever listen and hear evangelicals speak, lamenting against government intrusion into all of these issues of justice, but that's exactly what we need. There needs to be structural change in order to address an exclusionary political system, an unfair judicial system, a discriminatory economic system. And so I'm not sure that a white pastor speaking to a majority white congregation that believes only in kind of individual soul salvation and not necessarily the larger context of the scriptures that talk about justice, that they have the proper tools to do that work, because it's not embedded in who they are in the movement as it was created. It was created as a referendum on all of that kind of work.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you asked this to two people, but I mean, Marla just like dropped the whole like, you know, a submarine, you know, bomb and then detonated it, you know, because that's just absolutely right. You mentioned earlier that, you know, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the bastions of evangelical thinking. And one of the ways in which my colleagues, my seminarian colleagues at the time, they negotiated the social issue if they didn't avoid it at all, along with even professors that I had. If they negotiated the social issue or didn't just altogether just say that it's a sideshow altogether, is they would say that the gospel is about the salvation of your heart, and that should have social effects. They would, again, put the premium on the individual and then say, oh, and it should have these social effects. And I think what Marla, with that brilliant quote that she gave from the person who authored Mississippi Praying, what both Marla and that author are pointing to is that we need another imagination of what Christianity is about. We need another imagination of what Christianity is about. It's not about the way I wrote it in my notes here as I was listening to Marla just lay this out, is that what we have to reckon with is what the logic of individualism both denies and at the same time underwrites. It denies the social gospel movement, movements for justice. It denies these social intervention justice practices at the very same time as through that denial, it underwrites already a certain vision of what the political is about. The individualism logic of evangelicalism is political.
Right.
It's just violently political. Mm. And it denies that it's political, even in being political. It denies politicality in such a way that you then have the predicate, the theological Christian predicate, to not intervene when somebody's got their knee on somebody's neck, extinguishing their life. So it's false to say that evangelicalism isn't political. It is political, but its politicality is shielded through its individualism, which then becomes an alibi. And when you think about it, the Jesus that's talked about in scripture would not fit into that. This is the Jesus who spit on the ground, made a spittle, and instituted a new all people healthcare program. he's political. So much so that the rulers and authorities say we got to kill him, because if his vision of life gets the upper hand, it's over for us. His death was political.
Shut up.
The question is, what kind of politicality are we talking about?
Now, we got to get to this question, Michaela, and you know what? We need to flip the script because she is a student and we can ask her a student. But let me just interject just for 2 seconds. I'm supposed to be a host. So let me just say this. First of all, one, that this work is not in front of us. It's already behind us. When you look at Vernon Johns, you look at Henry Highland Garnett, you look at even Nat Turner, these theologies that these people had was a direct subversive response to the religion that was given to them to maintain their enslavement. So the reality is, what we fail because white supremacy is so profoundly powerful that they give us the illusions that this work is ahead of us when it's really behind us. They just don't tell us this. So when you listen to Twitter and they say, who's the top 50 preachers from the last century, they can only name Tony Evans. They don't know anybody else. Why would they know anybody else? Martin King don't even make the list. And so that's a problem. I said, too, in Galatians, the scripture talks about that who gave you this other Jesus? And I dare say what you're saying, Jay, is that what was given to us was another Jesus, but not the Jesus that we need to find in the text that not only redeems our soul, but he also lives in our body, because the truth and the reality of this, the evangelicalism that you guys are talking about, doesn't even allow the black person who loved Jesus to be reconciled to know that that same Jesus loves their black body and lives in their black body. That's what we need to deal with. I'm sorry, but go ahead, Mike. Yeah, wait. We still have a steady audience. We're going to keep going. But Michaela, ask the next question, because I'm going to pontificate and I shouldn't.
All right. The next question. There we go. From Kimberly Floyd Blanding. Where lots of people have talked about having discussions with their children as a result of what went on with regard to George Floyd. How do we have these conversations without reinforcing the Black code or internalizing what we don't want to persist? I'm going to turn this to Miss Linda and then to Jay.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we always have to tell the truth to our children. When you withhold truth, it results in crazy making. So you tell the truth, and you tell it on an age appropriate level. You tell the whole truth as they can digest it, and you're present with them as they come back to the question, as they come back to the answers, and you keep turning it over with them, keep processing it with them, because it is not helpful. Especially, it's not helpful to Black kids, but any children. It's not helpful to deny the reality of the world that we're living within. And so to help them to be people of integrity and honor, you teach them how to deal with the truth, and you do it on an age appropriate level using words that they can understand. And you are present with them in all the feelings and emotions that arise out of that. And that you don't have to have the perfect reply or the perfect answer or have your feelings resolved or worked through, but you should be able to be in it and present with them as they process and continue to process is this disruptive, terrifying time, because kids are brilliant. They know more than what we give them credit for. So they're taking it in, they're absorbing, they're sensing what's going on. And so it is up to us to tell them the truth. And again, when we deny them the truth, we create craziness. We've got to tell them the truth.
You know, and it
Go ahead.
It makes me think of all the kinds of conversations that I've had with friends. You know, even just about, you know, if you're listening to loud rap music when you pull up to the gas station, should you turn the loud rap music down? Because you might get shot by somebody who thinks you're a thug. Or, you know, just having a conversation this past week with a friend who said, I wish black guys would just stop wearing hoodies. If they're going to be such a problem, just stop wearing hoodies. And I thought, that's not the response. But I dated somebody once who was from New York and said that, you know, when we would go out, he'd wear this suit, right? He'd wear a suit without a tie. It was always a black suit jacket with pants without a tie. And I was like, do you ever wear jeans? He said, no, I stopped wearing jeans because I got tired of getting thrown up against the side of a building when I walked the streets in New York. And so all of these ways in which Black people have kind of contorted ourselves in order to not be seen as threatening, right? To present a respectable self that will not invite unwanted attention. And so that's, to me, part of the heart of that question that's just so infuriating.
Yeah, but you know, Michaela, I got to tell you, I've watched kids when my kids were in a daycare, and I watched the difference between white parents and Black parents. White parents let that white dude take over the whole day camp, just take over, because it almost teaches them in the beginning that the whole world is theirs and it's out there for them to grab and to take. And then I watch our Black parents. We're always saying, don't go over there. Stay right here. Let me see you. And it's almost, we're teaching them those Black codes. not because we want them to teach those bad codes, but we know that we're trying to preserve their life. And I just posted a poem, an article I got from my wife, where it said, "When our Black boys grow up to be threats." I mean, I got 3 sons, and you know, when my wife was pregnant with my oldest son, she was in depression for 3 months because she didn't want to have a Black boy, because she knew what his life was like when he came into this world. It's struggling with codes. We got one more question. We're doing good, people. Y'all are amazing. All right, Danielle Mellett. Here we go. These are very important conversations to have. My only struggle is understanding some of what is being said as a layperson who has not had schooling in theology. Wondering if there's an opportunity to have a discussion broken down for the general public.
J. Cameron Carter. There, so we can understand. Equal playing field, my brother.
Go ahead, Rick. Rick and Jay, go ahead.
One of the things that I've sort of gathered from the 2 theologians tonight, and J. Cameron, I went to Dallas Theological a long time ago.
Okay.
What you're articulating, and I found it very, very interesting to hear it, to talk about the individualism of evangelicalism, and I think that's a very good way of thinking about it. And the way I've interpreted that, or tried to internalize that, is to think about it as being as it's segmenting Jesus's ministry, segmenting Jesus and what he was trying to accomplish. That Jesus wasn't just about one aspect of redeeming us. It wasn't about one aspect of calling into or standing up for and articulating the wrong and the evil of what he saw. Everything about him spoke truth. I mean, he declared for himself that he was true. And so if you think about it in those terms, when white evangelicalism focuses on things that don't extol the virtue of justice, that don't advance the notion of individual rights and the value of all human beings, all of that is in denial and is an affront to who Jesus was and what he taught. And what you're describing about white evangelicalism, in my judgment, when you talk about individualism, what you're saying to me, as I would understand it, is you're carving away, the white evangelicalism has simply carved away various aspects of who Jesus was and what he was trying to do. Otherwise, much as you've said, there would be no reason for Herod sitting in his palace to want to kill an itinerant preacher out in the hills. Why?
Right.
The reason you do is because he's a threat. And he's a threat because he's teaching something radically different. He's empowering individuals, but he's empowering them across a broad spectrum. He's saying to women that you matter. He's saying to Gentiles that you're to be included. He's saying to any number of people that are being isolated and set apart by whether it's Rome or whether it's the Pharisees or whomever it might have been, that's not who he was. And so when evangelicalism carves out various aspects of his ministry and his concern for people, that to me is seemingly what you're saying is a core fault of what evangelicalism does. And when you said that your grandmother's version of Christianity exhibited something different than that, what I saw as you were saying that was a reflection of my grandmother, who I would have felt the very same way about. She exhibited, I mean, she didn't have degrees in any of those things, but she exhibited to me the core teachings of Jesus Christ in a way that I live every day to try to emulate.
Yeah. No, I can't agree with you more on that. In many respects, all I was trying to do is take with absolute seriousness the form of thought that is embedded inside of the kind of life my grandmother was living.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there was a form of thinking inside of that. There was, I want to say it, there was a form of thinking inside of that. So
Yeah.
on one level, I was trying to just, and I've just been in many respects trying to just catch up with her and what I saw her doing.
Yeah.
That's all I've been trying. I've been trying to catch up with that. What kind of Christianity, what version, what genre of Christianity is this that yielded this kind of life?
Yeah.
That allowed her to make a way out of no way, that allowed her not only to make gumbo, but to live a gumbo life.
Oh, now you shut up now, boy.
What was this? Right.
Yeah.
And what was it against the backdrop
That's right.
of how the form of Christianity that we've been schooled into by virtue of our citizenship?
Right.
But our citizenship encodes, it is underwritten by a certain form of Christianity. So in many respects, I'm not trying and striving for complication or density for its own sake. But on the one hand, I'm trying to, on the one hand, render as simple as I can the form of practice that my grandmother was doing, but also to say that was some deep stuff she was doing.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm trying to say. There was some deep stuff she was doing. So I'm trying to
Absolutely.
do that on the one hand. And on the other hand, what I'm trying to say to those who would be committed to a certain kind of evangelicalism that is underwritten by this individual. And I wrote this down because I'm going to read this the way I wrote it. I'm interested in unpacking how individualism moves in relationship to a certain form of Christianity, how that individualism underwrites whiteness. How it underwrites whiteness, and how whiteness itself must be understood, therefore, as a mode of religion. And more specifically, how that mode of religion piggybacks on Christianity, almost like a leech. It leeches on its thought forms. It draws upon the Christian language. It mobilizes the Christian lexicon. It mobilizes the Christian imaginary to fuel whiteness as itself a religious practice. And by religious practice, I mean this: whiteness, or white as the new transcendence, where whiteness functions as a God term. It operates the way in which we think about God, the transcendent, the supreme, and therefore anything underneath that is read by implication as the demonic, the devil. The way in which that police officer looked at Michael Brown and said, when I looked at him, I saw a demon looking back at me. What kind of social imaginary is operative to let that statement work? When that man drove his knee in George Floyd's neck, what powers the inhumanity that is being ascribed to him? He wouldn't kill a human being. He's got to be looking at him as less than a human being. How does that work? All I'm trying to do, forgive me for whatever density, I'm struggling to try and make it as plain as I can, but all I'm trying to do is understand the insanity, the logic that fuels that insanity, and how that logic is tied up with Christianity, the way in which this individualism works. That's all I'm trying to do.
And you
And
do.
on one level, the stuff is deep. On another level, it's not deep.
Yeah.
Shut up. You're right.
And to the extent that the theological is political, to your point, Jay, we haven't talked about this, but to think about 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump, and then to think about 96% of Black women voting against him, and knowing that some vast majority of Black women are Protestant Christians, right? And yet, white evangelicals employed the notion that if you didn't vote for Trump, you weren't Christian. Just like they did when they voted for George Bush. If you didn't vote for George Bush, you weren't Christian. And so there's a way in which their theological is so superimposed upon the political that they then render everybody else non-Christian, right?
Right.
And so even if you're in white evangelical spaces, oftentimes Black people are on the margins. Black and brown people are on the margins trying to push against the center, trying to change something. And I just don't know the efficacy of that project because it's so deeply ingrained, again, in the white evangelical project that's been a part of the late 20th and early 21st century.
Yeah, but that's why you're the board chair for the Impact Movement that's trying to unpack that for the next generation of Black college students. But let me go to Michaela Powell because she has a question.
So the Impact Movement is a student-led organization, and I know we have right now. Are we good?
Well, mute everybody, and then let her ask.
Okay. And so my question is to everyone: what advice would you give to young believers who want to push justice, love, and peace in the way that Christ did currently, and also as they go into transition into vocation and their residency? Because we are in an age of like social media where we see the world acting one way, but we know that our response as young believers, we have to respond in a different way. So what advice would you give for us to move forward?
Well, we haven't heard from Linda. Go ahead, Linda. Oh, can you hear me?
And one thing that I wanted to say, what the camera said, from a my stance is that when I see a cop or a white person murdering an unarmed Black person, for me, my mind immediately goes to they are trying to kill the monster that they know is on the inside of them, that they have projected into and onto the external reality. So every murder, when I watch that guy put his knee on George Floyd's neck, my mind immediately went to that is so profoundly inhumane, and wicked that no person who's loving, kind could conceivably do that to another human being. So then what must have been going on inside the mind, the heart, the being of a person that would do that? And it's the projection of that wicked, evil thing on the inside that will see another human being as less than, as the monster that must be killed and taken out. And so for me, whiteness, white supremacy is a projection. All the awful things that they think about people of color is really what's going on in the internal world that they split off and cannot deal with on their own. And it gets placed onto and into other people. For the young people who are on college campuses and who are about to enter into new fields, I think it's wise to surround yourself with wise people who will have honest conversations and smart conversations, and who can help you strategize about how to enter into this space. Because there's a strategy against us. There's a very, very cleverly formed warfare set out against us. So it's necessary to form a strategy, I believe, and to connect with a community of people that you can journey with, because you're not meant to do this alone. It's dangerous to try and step into this warfare alone. So connect with people, and know that your feelings are valid. Know that you're meant to bring transformation and change, and that your voice matters, that what you see and how you see is actually valid. And again, it matters to connect with people who will validate that for you and with you. That you're not meant to do this alone, that you can make impact, and that the world that you're entering into, you're meant to change. And if you are perceived as radical, that's okay, because the system that you've been operating within has been designed for your demise. And so sometimes it will be perceived as radical, but go forward anyway. But go forward with others.
I think we should let at least one other person answer that question that Michaela asked, if you don't mind. Rick, you want to take a chance at it? Oh, he's on mute again. There we go.
Remind me again of the question, so I'll speak directly to it.
So I was basically asking for advice for young believers, how to practically move forward with what's going on, how to move forward in justice, and how to move forward in love in the way that Christ did, currently and as we move into our vocations and our residency.
Okay. You know, I think Linda's point is really a very, very valid one to hold at heart. And that is that, first of all, surround yourself with people who are safe and people who have your best interests at heart, that you can be yourself with and that you can communicate in a way that they would understand, and then you in turn would understand them. But you know, the other thing that I have found is that it really helps to have an understanding of of who Jesus was and what he actually taught and how he conducted himself. You know, to read the scriptures, just try to understand, you know, what was this man, this God man, trying to accomplish, and how did he go about living his life in a hostile world, in a world that was hostile to him? How did he do it? And so, you know, I try to understand that God is sovereign, that God claims that for himself. And even when I look around and I see a world that has evil and harm and hurt, yet God claims for himself that he's sovereign. So I have to grapple with that and try to internalize what I believe the truth to be, not necessarily, you know, what the world at large might say the truth to be. So I think surrounding yourself with friends who have a similar worldview as yours, not necessarily exclusively, but certainly somebody who shares a worldview who can occasionally affirm you and help you to navigate some of the things that you'll encounter. And then, as Linda has said, is to recognize that you might be the radical. It's not that you're going to turn over the tables in the temple, but just your presence might make such a difference that you're going to be perceived as the radical. But you have to come to a point of understanding that, you know, that's okay, because I'm comfortable with that. And whatever the consequence may be, I can live with that because I must do this to be me. And if you can sort of get those core truths down for yourself as you enter into the vocational world, as you enter into friendships and acquaintances beyond college and beyond school, I think having that kind of grounding will really help you. I found it to be very beneficial to me.
All right, we have one more question, and then I'll bring some closure for our evening. It's been a long night. Very gifted, lively panel. Dude, I saw one question. If you can just show that one more time.
Jimmy, while you're looking for that question, I just wanted to add to this. What I would have said is to read the scriptures, to study the life of Jesus, and also to realize that there's nothing new under the sun. And so we need to study our ancestors, study our history, study kings, study Martin Luther King, study Ida B. Wells Barnett, study Fannie Lou Hamer. Like, these people have walked this road before us and left a blueprint and left a narrative for us to appreciate and value and employ in this particular time period. And I don't say that just because I'm a professor. And I just want to state that. I say that because it will help tremendously inform their worldview in their life.
Hey, I'm learning to love studying. So
Excellent. You know, here we go. We got Jasmine Davis. She said, how can I, as a Black woman and a Christian, approach my non-Black friends on this situation? How can I help educate them rather than coming off as the angry Black women or Black woman? So, Jay, I want to go to you, but we might need to get a Black woman to answer that question first. What do you think? All right. So which one of the non-angry Black women going to answer that question for us?
Miss Linda, did you want to go?
I can, but I was going to defer to Marla.
Well, I've seen there's so many ways. If people aren't inviting the question, am I okay? Can I talk now? Is it clear? It's still muffled on my end, so if you hear me, that's fine. So much of this has to do with reading, right? I don't necessarily feel that it's Black people's responsibility to necessarily educate white people. I think white people who are really committed to being, as they say, anti-racist would do the work. I mean, my white friends who are committed to this work, they read on their own. We have great conversations. So it's about what is the will of that person to really be invested in doing this work. And there are a ton of bibliographies online for thinking about how to be anti-racist.
It looks like we're trying to get through some questions tonight before we end. That's one of our impact students. Go ahead, Michaela, and ask that question.
Hey, Rachel. Rachel Webb says, I've got people around me who believe that it's not our job to inform our white friends. The issue I have with that is many of my white friends want to help, but feel stuck because they never know what to do and not to say. How would you go about helping white people through grace and forgiveness?
Part of my response to the first question, which I thought she was talking about Black friends, and in the same way I think it will be relevant in this case, is that you can invite people to conversation, but you can't force them. So you can set the stage and again, invite them and not for necessarily debate, but invite them to a whole process of what are you reading, but how has your body come to the reading? How are you responding to the stories that you're hearing in the media? So this full-bodied engagement of what's going on in the world, what has happened, what are you engaging and reading and talking through? So all of it, I think, has to be invitational. Because the moment you try to force someone to read or engage, then it shuts down conversation. And so I think it's up to whether it's Black friends or whether it's white friends or people in your community to do the work. And it's not up to us to do the work for them or take the weight or the load of the work, but it's invitational and we can engage together.
And I think I want to just add on top of that. I know I had a conversation last year with one of my white friends. She asked me a question and I informed her different things and she felt like she was attacked. But it wasn't until she started to do her own research or walk through different books or, study for herself that she said, okay, now I'm understanding what you're saying. And I know that you were not trying to attack me, yet you were just trying to inform me. So I think not being afraid to start the conversation, but also encouraging them to say, hey, don't just take my word for it. Go study for yourself. See what other people are saying, because it might be hard for you to receive it from me.
One thing I want us to be very careful when we answer these questions, because white evangelicalism through racial reconciliation had this notion that if white people and Black people just became friends, we can dismantle racism. That is a misnomer. I think the other idea is that cognitive engagement can dismantle racism. What Jay Cameron and what Marla is saying, it's filtered in systematically. It's a complex oppression that is not just individually. I think Columbus Sally in his book, Your God is Too White, he says the infrastructures are already oppressive by themselves. So we don't even need individuals to take up these roles because the infrastructures and the systems around us already oppress us. But individuals corroborate, they collaborate, and they cooperate with supporting these structures to keep us under this place of oppression. So I think what we need to do is understand, if everybody began to get this right, we would be in trouble. And my battery's about to die. There we go. All right, we have one more question, and then we're going to close it out. All right. Charles Burbank from Florida, way back when, he was one of my students, Marla. Trevor Noah made a comment basically saying that society's laws are a social contract with one another, and when one side doesn't uphold its side of the contract, the other side eventually gets to a point where they will no longer uphold their side. What do you think about that? So I'm going to let Rick, as a lawyer, jump in, and then let Jay Cameron close us out.
Well, there are some philosophies, that teach that notion of a social contract. John Locke, that's sort of, the basis of what he articulated as the basis for society, that we all come to a state of nature with the same rights. And in order for us to live together, I give up certain of my rights. In turn, you give up certain of your rights so that we can live in a peaceful and balanced society. Because if I assert fully my right and you do the same, then we're at war. And so that's the notion behind the philosophy there. I think Jesus teaches something different. And what he teaches is, I believe, that, that we have within us, we all have the essence of God's spirit within each one of us. We all are image bearers, is how it's commonly referred to. And if once you come to know Christ and once you come to understand how radically different he has made your life, then I think you're in a position where you can make choices about what you, how you want to live your life and what you're willing to do in order to live with one another. But it doesn't mean that as Black people, we're the ones who have to make the adjustments in order to accommodate white supremacy. It doesn't mean that at all. And Christianity never, in its proper context, never should have required that. But what we've seen, as the two theologians have talked about tonight, is that Christianity has been co-opted to support these philosophical underpinnings about society. That's really not what Jesus taught. That's not who he was. And that's not what he calls us to. And so I really think it's a matter of understanding that what we have been called to or have been called out of is something different and something radically different than all of the rest of society. And that we have been called to love and to have empathy and kindness towards one another. But it doesn't mean that we are to never or not be the person that Linda has talked about. And that is a person who recognizes your worth, a person who recognizes your value and the truth of your existence and the importance of your own existence. Because to do other than that is to deny the God image within you. And so, that's Trevor Noah is right if you're looking at philosophy and sort of the philosophical underpinnings of society. In terms of what God has called us to, it may not be quite that.
Jay, do you want to jump in on this one?
Let me see. Okay. Yeah, I saw those comments that I hope let's see. No. One more time with my Can you hear me at all? You can hear me now. Great. Fantastic. Though I can't hear you all, but if you can hear me, that's fine. What I was going to say was I saw those comments by Trevor Noah, and on the one hand, I mean, I appreciate those his comments. I think he was making a really important point, and this goes along with what Richard was just saying. And I'm just going to understand, I think, the point that he was making, and then just going to supplement it a little bit. He was making the point that basically modern societies grounded in constitutions and reason, blah, 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 are supposedly founded on a social contract where everybody is basically contractual partners, and society therefore is meant to benefit each person who is in the social contract, provided that they perform and uphold their end of the contract, that they perform their duties in the contract. And Trevor Noah was making the point that in many respects, America has never treated the non-black, the non-white, and particularly the black, as a party to the contract. They've never treated us as a party to the contract, and therefore, in many respects, we're outside the contract. And what the protest and the uprising is pointing to is an acknowledgement that that is actually the state of affairs, right? And so it's not that Black folk are breaching the contract when they go and, if someone goes in and loots, a Target or what have you, but rather Trevor Noah's point is that America is founded upon a contract that you can read as always already breached with respect to Black people, or that is predicated upon the exclusion of Black people. And what he's pointing to fundamentally is how the we the people is already violent and a breach. And all that the rioting is doing is pointing to that. When again, that police officer put his foot on the neck of George Floyd, it wasn't so much that it was a kind of breach of contract. It was an acknowledgement in some respects that to be Black in this country is to be outside the contract anyway. And what that therefore requires, and this is where we can get to Richard's point, what that therefore requires is a different social imagination. Now, many people will turn to Jesus, my grandmama and them, right, who helped raise me. They introduced me to a version of understanding Jesus, not as the basis of an empowered individualism, but as the ground of a different type of social imaginary that is what I call a non-exclusionary we, rather than the exclusionary we of we the people. A different kind of constitutionalism. And therefore, to follow Jesus within the terms of the social contract, which is basically a contract of whiteness that grounds the American polity, to follow Jesus is to fundamentally breach that contract. This is what I was trying to get to earlier today. Why is it that our Christianity is read in terms of the order of things, the social contract, and the whiteness thereof, rather than a fundamental breach of contract in the name of what is otherwise, in the name of what is possible, beyond the impossible violence that we're living through right now? And so I think that in many respects, that was what Trevor was like. He was starting to lean on that issue, the way in which the social imaginary and the presumptions of the contract that underwrite it, how it works, and the whiteness of that contract, and how that whiteness plays out as a violence against the non-white. And from that vantage point, the social contract can be read as always already breached, and most deeply as a fundamental terror. The social contract that grounds America is a contract of terror. It is terrorism. The loot started with settler colonial plunder. That's what grounds the contract.
Okay, this is the last question. Oh wait, somebody want to say? Richard want to say something?
No,
Go on, Rick.
Am I muted?
I'll defer to Marlon.
No, I was just saying. So what you're saying is loving on that contract.
I didn't hear you. Can you repeat that, please?
I was just saying that from what Jay Cameron said, loving Jesus then is a referendum on that very contract, that white supremacist contract that's undergirding what we're seeing today.
Right.
Absolutely. It's a referendum on the contract, and it's a statement towards something else.
Yeah.
Towards the otherwise, towards what's possible, towards what exceeds what is.
Right.
And having heard what you've said, because I hadn't heard Trevor Noah's comment, and so it's more fundamental than what I was talking about. I was talking about it in a traditional philosophical perspective. But to say what you've just said about the American contract, you're exactly right. I mean, you can look at our history, and particularly just look at the struggle that the Supreme Court has been in since 1789 to now. I mean, all of that struggle, all of the major discourses within the Supreme Court are struggling with the very notion that you're talking about, how Black people are outside of the social contract. So that when Plessy versus Ferguson is decided, you can say separate but equal is the requirement of the law, because these people are outside. Or you can say under Dred Scott that a Black man has no rights that a white man is required to respect. I mean, and so you just see time and again how they're massaging this whole notion of what you're just articulating. That is that you're outside of the contract, and at various times we may, in incremental ways, extend the contract to you or not. So if that's the point that he was making, I absolutely agree that that's an important point.
All right, last question. And Cameron, go get that power code before I pointed mine in. Go get yours. All right.
Can I read this one?
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this is one that I know me and my friends have been dealing with. Danya Danye says, how do you create a balance between staying aware and alert of what's going on and detaching from media and taking your mind off of it, distract yourself to stay mentally healthy?
That's a therapist question.
Miss Linda.
I'm gonna mute myself.
It's important to understand that we have limitations, right? So we've already acknowledged that we are all in trauma. And so there is a limit to the heartache that we can take in and still feel well. So know that it is legitimate and that it is good self-care, that you can step away from the news cycle and get some peace, to feel restored, do self-care. That you don't, it's no judgment against you if you step away and for a moment you don't have the most current information of what's happening in the country. You have to know that you were meant for rest, you're meant for restoration, and so that you can step away from the trauma and actually care for yourself, because it winds up being counterproductive to take in all the news, to take in all the images and the stories and the angles, and it gets stored in your body and you have no way of processing or releasing or ability to do anything about it. So you have the freedom, and I think it is honoring the self, honoring your body, to step away from it for a season and do something that's going to be restorative. Whatever brings you joy, whatever brings you goodness, whatever brings you a sense of peace and rest, do it. And if you aren't aware of what brings that to you, then find out, discover where you can go to be restored. And actually, I saw a quote in a museum at one point that said, for those who were enslaved, the way they resisted their enslavement was that they found pleasure. They found a way to have joy and goodness. And that's what I would encourage students who are struggling with that, is to find a way to see goodness in the world, because it still exists.
Well, tonight I want to thank our panel. You guys were just utterly amazing. Marla, Linda, Rick, Jay Cameron, and we got to show some love for our student host. She did a great job, Michaela. I mean, she came through, made it looks good. And then behind the scenes, you guys don't know it at the end, is Tracy and Kayla. This is an exceptional conversation that we hope people will continue on. There's some important information that some of our panelists gave to us. Jay Cameron, there's a fan club for you that's coming together, and they want to know how to follow you on social media, either by Twitter or by Facebook. So I think we can post that in with your permission. There's some paperwork that Rick gave us for some of the people in Atlanta who are caught in the process with the police that we can use within our spaces here in Georgia that can help them when they're interacting with the law. That's very important. You can find Linda. Linda is doing work and more work, right, Linda, with the Allender Center to partner with us to deal with trauma, because at Impact, we're trying to deal with trauma and prepare our staff to engage our students so that they can be healed and whole as they go on. And I can't say enough about my board chair. She's utterly amazing. She got to get me one of those t-shirts she has, though. But I'm so grateful for her being in Emory, in Atlanta, or wherever she is. I can't keep hold with her, but she's ghosting. And I think she is around in the Atlanta area these days. Let me say two things about the Impact Movement. One thing, since my board chair is here. First, the Impact Movement seeks to serve Black students, Caribbean, African-American, Black, Afro-Latino, and Africans, to help them see alternative ways outside of white evangelicalism to connect to Jay Cameron's grandmother's faith, and to understand what it means to infiltrate our spaces. And to, one of my heroes is Charles Hamilton Houston, who really drove in the life of a Howard Law School, that his students had choices. They can go ahead and become middle class upon graduation and live a quiet life, or they can become a threat to white evangelicalism and white supremacy and fight the empire and be social engineers. And the first valedictorian with Thurgood Marshall. Well, it's our dream in the Impact Movement that every student in the Impact Movement, when they graduate from college in excellence and they find their vocation and their place, that they will infiltrate and be social engineers on behalf of the kingdom of God. We need a different kind of faith for the world we live in now. It's a tragedy that in 2020, we still have 300 years of living and fighting the same battle our early ancestors had when they first got here. And last, I've never said this before on this show, so two other comments. One, if you desire to give to the Impact Movement, you can visit the Impact Movement page and make a donation to us. We welcome that donation. We're the only national Black campus ministry as a whole, as an organization that exists, and we need your assistance. As we go forward, we won't be here next week. We're doing real talk every other week. So we hope 2 weeks from now, you'll join in with us. It's going to be a doozy. I promise you, as we continue to dismantle white evangelicalism and to really give faith to our students that they can live on and thrive in. I want to say thank you again to all the guests and all our audience who stood with us for almost 2 hours. Thank you very much. Have a good night and hopefully a good meal. Thank you.